Hello, and how are you feeling? Coaching from Not a Blue Tree with me, Gary Burns. This episode is all about representational systems. And this episode is the first in this series, which is very specifically about language, the linguistic part of NLP. Representational systems are the systems our senses use to take in, store, and code information in our minds, and then to retrieve that stored information when we wish to access it. So you'll remember from Series 3, Episode 4, when I talked about the NLP communication model, that we experience the world through our five senses. So we're interpreting everything we experience through what we see, hear, feel, taste, and smell. And then within that, as we're taking in all that information, there is what's sometimes described as a sixth sense, which is auditory digital. So the language we use, the words we use to describe those experiences. And the reason that representational systems forms an important part of NLP is because we all have our preferences. You'll be aware that some people are visual, some people are auditory, some people are kinesthetic. And some people, of course, are very much about the language, the way we use the words to describe our experiences. And over the years, we will have found that certain systems work better for us. And we find techniques, we find ways of working so that when experiences don't necessarily fit our preferred system, that we can adapt and create a kind of shorthand, a kind of our own language to convert those experiences into a way which works best for us. And that's really important on several levels. First of all, if we understand our own representational system, so our own preferences, we can first of all make sure that we have the tools to adapt and translate what's going on around us into a way which works for us. And secondly, if we find for any reason that doesn't work, then if we understand what our preferred system is, it means that we can then shift into a different system. And an example of this for me is I'm very auditory digital, so I like a good explanation. I like to follow the words, the language that people are using. And I took a job once where someone tried to explain to me how a work rota worked. And there were various complexities, to the rota that meant it didn't sort of follow what I would normally have expected. And I just couldn't get my head around the explanation, no matter how hard I tried. And I really did want to understand it. In fact, it was really important that I understood it. Couldn't make it work for me. So I shifted. And instead of using an auditory digital approach, I took a visual approach. So I created a copy of the rota. And instantly I could understand what was going on. So that's how it can help us. The other reason that it's so important is that it can help us, and this goes back to rapport, it can help us build rapport. So if we understand other people's representational system, we can change the way we communicate to a way that meets other people's preferred systems. And that can be quite straightforward if you're doing something one-to-one. However, if you're delivering to a group, talking to a group of people, where there's likely to be multiple preferences, including people from each of the four standard preference groups, you can make sure you include something that's visual to appeal to those who are visual. You can make sure there's something auditory, something for people to listen to. And for those who are auditory digital, you can make sure that your explanations are clear and crisp and use precise language. Getting in with the kinesthetic people can be a challenge. And there is a very handy shortcut, a very handy hack here. Open your session and ask everyone how they're feeling today. The kinesthetics in your group will love you for it, because they will instantly think, that's a question I'm not usually asked. And I'm feeling fine. It's useful in understanding ourselves and how we're processing the world, what our preferred system is. It's helpful in understanding that other people may have different systems And if we're working one-to-one, we can switch. And it doesn't mean we have to switch all of the time. I'm very struck by when I'm working with people who are very auditory and I'm giving an explanation or I'm talking about something, you just have to use the follow-up question, how does that sound to you? Notice the word sound. How does that sound to you? And instantly you're drawing people in because that's their preferred system. Just as the question, how does that look to you, will appeal to the visuals. And for the kinesthetics, how does that feel? With those who are auditory digital, we have to be a little more precise. What's your response to that? Does that fit in with your understanding? What would you like to say to that? What observations do you have? And again, it's just those slight phrases, that slight shift from system to system to system that draws people in, that allows you to build rapport. So I was really thinking very hard of a way to sort of demonstrate all of this in a way that will be helpful. So what I've come up with, and this is where you've got to put your listening head on and really focus on what I'm saying. I've got 4 short pieces to read to you. One of them is written kinesthetically. One of them is written auditory digitally. One of them is written auditory, and one of them is written visually. So within each, the language appeals to one of those preferences. So it could be visual, could be auditory, could be kinesthetic, could be auditory digital. And in each of them, I'm going to be describing the same holiday experience. So listen and decide, what's the preference there? What's the preference in this one? So here we go with number 1. It was an amazing holiday because every day had something different to enjoy. We spent days on the beach, and I loved listening to the waves rolling in and out, the laughter of families, children calling to each other, and the gentle buzz of people chatting all around us. Every now and then, I'd hear the thud of a volleyball being hit, the splashing and excited shouts of people in the sea. And as the evening drew in, everything seemed to quieten down, leaving the soothing sound of the water and the peaceful atmosphere. We also took a couple of day trips. We visited some temple ruins, and I enjoyed hearing the stories behind the ancient buildings and imagining the conversations that might have taken place there centuries ago. It made me wonder what those people would say if they could hear us now, and what they would make of the way we live today. So that was the first one. So this is the second one. It was an amazing holiday because we had the opportunity to experience so many different activities, and each one added something worthwhile to the trip. Spending time on the beach gave me the chance to slow down and appreciate how important it is to step away from everyday routines. It was interesting to notice how everyone was enjoying themselves in their own way, and it made me realise that people can share the same place while having completely different experiences. We also took a couple of day trips. Visiting the temple ruins really made me think. As I walked around, I found myself considering what life must have been like for the people who built them and how their world compared with ours. It raised all kinds of questions about history, progress, and how future generations might interpret the way we live today. It was one of those experiences that stayed with me long after we had left, because it gave me so much to reflect on. So this is now number 3. It was an amazing holiday because every day felt different and gave us the chance to experience something new. We spent days on the beach, and I loved the feeling of the warm sand beneath my feet, the heat of the sun on my skin, and the refreshing coolness of the sea whenever I went for a swim. There was something so relaxing about stretching out, letting the warmth soak into me, and feeling all the tension disappear. Watching people enjoying themselves made the whole place feel alive. And as the evening arrived, the cooler air and gentle breeze created such a peaceful, comfortable atmosphere. We also took a couple of day trips. We explored some temple ruins, and I enjoyed walking through them, running my hands over the ancient stone and sensing the history all around me. It was easy to imagine what life must have felt like centuries ago, and to wonder how those people would react if they could stand beside us and experience the world as it is today. And the final one. It was an amazing holiday as we did so many different things. We spent days on the beach, which I loved. The golden sand, the clear blue water, people everywhere just doing their own thing. I got to watch people playing volleyball. I saw people swimming. And the view across the bay when the sun started to set was stunning. We also took a couple of day trips. We visited temple ruins. And I really enjoyed looking at the remains of the buildings, imagining scenes from centuries ago. What would they make of us now if they could see us? You've had your 4 texts, each one framed in a slightly different way, and yet each one pretty much talking about the same events, just a slightly different focus, a slightly different sensory focus. And when I first learnt about this, I really did wonder if people actually did speak differently depending on their preference. And again, as I've said before in some of these podcasts, I've not done a scientific study, but I am in a fortunate position where I get to talk to a lot of people. And sure enough, if you're listening, you really can pick up on people's sensory preferences. So thinking about how this can help us, the first thing to think about for self is we have what's called a primary representational system. And this is our preferred system for processing, for taking the information in. And that's really important to understand. So it goes back to that sense. Are you visual? Are you auditory? Are you kinesthetic? Are you auditory digital? And it's about understanding how you can play to your strengths and what you need to do if things are being presented in a way which doesn't really work for you. And I'm very struck by one of the examples that I refer to quite a lot, and it really struck me thinking back to my days at university. Lectures, for example, are very much aimed at the auditory. There's a lot of talking, so as the student you do a lot of listening. Sometimes lectures are illustrated, so there's some visual stuff, but there's very little, if anything, about the feelings. And some people are just not very good at explaining their stuff. Some people are just not very interesting. I remember one lecture delivered by a police officer, and I'm sure as a police officer, he was very good at his job. But as someone presenting, he was not the best presenter. Now, if you're on the receiving end of that and you want to take all that information in, if you're someone who's auditory, you're really going to enjoy the lecture. You're going to find that really easy to absorb and process the information. But if you're not, then it becomes quite difficult. And it's interesting noting how people adopt different strategies to cope with that. So the visual people will be drawing pictures, they'll be writing stuff down, they'll be using different colours. The kinesthetic people will want to be much more in tune with the feelings behind it all. And that's where you see mind maps and spider diagrams and things like that, which allow people to capture the feeling of what's being said. The auditory digital people will be writing stuff down, turning it into language which makes sense for them. And it's about understanding that so you too can adopt those strategies. I'm not very auditory at all, which is really weird in the different jobs I do where I have to listen to people a lot. When it's part of work and listening, I find that really quite easy to do. When I have to go to a lecture or a talk or a training event where there's a lot of listening, I need strategies to keep my interest, to keep my focus. I make notes, I do little jottings, I note down salient points. I have to be doing something, otherwise my mind starts to wander, and then I miss things, and that's not great. And then we also have our lead representational system. So that's the system we use when we're retrieving memories. Sometimes our primary and our lead representational system are the same, and sometimes they are different. And that I found quite curious to start with. And then I realised I'm auditory digital for taking the stuff in. I'm actually really quite visual for retrieving the information. And again, it's about understanding that, because again, it's about playing to your strengths. And if that strength for some reason fails you, then it's about adopting a different process. So as I said before, someone was trying to explain something to me, which is usually the way I get and understand things. It didn't work. I had to draw something. I had to actually draw up a rota. And then suddenly it all made sense. So similarly, I'm aware that quite often to remember things, I need a visual trigger of some kind. And if for any reason that visual trigger doesn't work, then I have to find an alternative way. Can I think back to the event? How was I feeling? Can I remember a description of what happened? Did I hear something that takes me back to the moment? And the more we can do that, the more we can take on board information and then retrieve information when we need it. And the same applies with other people. And as I said before, you don't have to completely switch your system. So as someone who's auditory digital, I don't need to suddenly go all kinesthetic, all touchy-feely to talk to people who are kinesthetic. I do, though, need to make sure that I drop in things that will appeal to those who are kinesthetic, just as I can drop in things for those who are visual, those who are auditory digital, and those who are auditory. The question then is, how does that work in practice? So the first step really is to understand what your representational system is. And within the blurb for this podcast, there is a link which will take you to questionnaire, quite a brief questionnaire that you just score. There's no trick questions. You just do it as quickly as you can. And then there's an answer sheet which shows you how to score and what that tells you about your preferences. That's the first step. The second step is to start listening. Really listen to what other people are saying. Really listen to the type of language they're using. It will give you clues. And the important thing to remember with all of this, and this is something that I say an awful lot, because there are lots of different questionnaires that tell you about your personality type, your way of working, what kind of role you play within teams. There are hundreds and hundreds of questionnaires out there. You will probably have come across a few, if not many. If you've done different jobs over the years, these kind of questionnaires come into vogue and then they go out again. The one that lots of people know and talk about is Myers-Briggs. It talks about different personality types. The mistake I think people make with all of these, just as you could make the mistake with your representational system preferences, is assuming that's how I am and I can't do anything else. No. This gives you indicators to preference. It is not a straitjacket that limits you. It is simply an indicator. And as I said before, if you understand where your preference is, for some of you, when you do the questionnaire, you will discover you have quite strong preferences in one direction or another. Some of you though, will discover that actually you score pretty evenly across all four, sometimes across three, sometimes across two. But you may find that there's not one system that stands out as the one that's really strong for you. It's neither a good thing or a bad thing. It is what it is. Now, though, you have information about representational systems. You understand that you have a primary representational system that is your preference for processing information as it comes in. You also understand that you have a lead representational system, a system that you use to retrieve stuff. So things that you already know, to retrieve those memories. If you know what your preferred systems are, they can be your go-to. How do you make them even stronger? And how do you adapt? What strategies are you going to use when information is being presented in a way which does not match your preference? And again, that's something to think about because everyone is different. And I go back to the thing, I've seen visual people who will write in lots of different colours, will use highlighters, will use different colour papers. I've seen auditory people who, if there's a lot of visual stuff, you can see them almost mentally narrating what's going on because that's their way of converting it into a way that makes sense for them. It's about just working out what works for you. And if, as I found on one occasion, where something just really wasn't making sense, try with a different system. Turn it into something else. See what that gives you. And that's two ways, whether it's for your primary, for your lead. If you're struggling to recall something because you're desperately trying to see it, think about hearing it. Think about feeling it. Think about describing it. Or if you're auditory digital as your lead, so you like the description to come up, try something visual. But that gives you the power. That gives you the ability, now you know about this, to shift your focus. It also means you can pick up, start to observe what other people do. See what their preferences are. As I said before, you don't need to shift your entire way you communicate, but just dropping things in from time to time keeps people on board. And I think it's really important if you're talking to a group of people, whether it's a training exercise, whether it's just a group discussion. Make sure that there is something there for the visual people. Make sure there is something for the auditory people to listen to. For the kinesthetic people, drop those things in. And one of the things that I found works really, really well with kinesthetic people is get them up and doing something. Because there is the kinesthetic sense of moving around. I remember some years ago I was delivering a training event, and rather than sort of getting people to choose option A, B, C or D, we put 4 signs up in the 4 corners of the room. We got people walking around the room. And you could tell who the kinesthetics were, because suddenly this was turned into movement and a feeling of, am I in the right place? Have I picked the right answer? Am I standing in the right corner? And it was really interesting to observe. And as I said at the very beginning, this is the first podcast of this series which is talking very specifically about the language, the linguistic part of NLP. Because representational systems leads into the type of language, I did think about putting it all together in one podcast, but we would have been here all day. My voice would have disappeared and you would have fallen asleep listening to it all. So this first one is just to bring into your awareness the fact that we do have preferences around our representational systems. They tend to fall into one of those 4. We're auditory, we're visual, we're kinesthetic, or we're auditory digital. We have a primary representational system, a way for bringing information in. We have a lead representational system, accessing those memories. We can play around with them to best effect. We can start to develop the skills to sort of translate from one system into another so that it works for us. And in the next episode, I'm going to talk a bit more about the language that sits behind it. So I'm going to introduce some of the words, some of the phrases that you will find people use depending on which representational system is their preference. So, as I've already said, there is a link which takes you to a representational system test. Do the test, tick the boxes, and then look at the answers. See what it tells you about yourself. Ask yourself what that means for you. Some people find this quite eye-opening because it's a sudden realization of that's why I found that so difficult to do, because it was using a different system that didn't work for me. And that now shows you a way to work in the future. See how you get on. Start listening to other people. See if you can work out what their representational systems are. And join me on the next podcast to find out more.